Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar. This is Secondary Traumatic Stress, Compassion Fatigue, titled This is Hard Work, This Work That We Do, and We Are Making a Difference, presented by the CEBC and Alan O'Malley Larson. This webinar is hosted by the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, commonly referred to as the CEBC. My name is Jennifer Rolls-Roots. I'm the co-director of the CEBC, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I hope that you'll bear with me a bit today as several of the CBC staff members are out sick, and this is actually my first time running a webinar completely on my own, so thank you in advance. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to review a couple of webinar logistics. So first, actually get that to work. Let's see. There we go. Okay. For those who are new to Zoom, in your lower left-hand side of the screen, you'll see something called audio settings. We have muted all of the attendees, but you can still test your audio connection and select whatever speakers or headphone you want to use. We are not going to be using the raise hand feature during the webinar. If you have questions for the presenter or for me during the webinar, please submit them using the Q&A section that's at the bottom of the screen. We will be saving your presenter questions for the end of the presentation. We'll have time allocated for that. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the CEBC website for anyone to view within the next few days, along with the PowerPoint slides and relevant handouts. You will receive an email when the recording is posted, and that email will also contain a link to the handouts. Lastly, at the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to a brief feedback survey so that the CEBC can improve our webinars and make them as useful and relevant as possible. You'll also receive an email with a link to the survey shortly after the conclusion of this webinar, probably within the next 24 hours. So for those who are not familiar with the CEBC, the majority of our work can be found on our publicly accessible website, the cebc4cw.org, where we review the evidence for about 500 practices relevant to children, youth, and parents involved in or at risk for involvement in the child welfare system. The CEBC website currently has programs in over 50 topic areas, including mental health, parent training, anger management, substance abuse, and many other areas relevant to child welfare. Anyone can access and explore the information and materials on the CEBC website, and we encourage you to do so if you haven't already. The CEBC is funded by the California Department of Social Services Office of Child Abuse Prevention and operated by the Chadwick Center for Children and Families at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Oh, actually, before we do that, we're going to start with a couple of quick polls. So let me launch this first one. The first one is going to be about, give us a little more information about who is on the webinar today. So I'm going to relaunch that poll. Thank you. Okay, hopefully people are now seeing a poll on what service sector you work in: direct service, supervisor or manager, administrative support, director, organizational lead. Oh, looks like I'm on the one on service sector. Thank you for answering that. I got ahead of myself there. So it looks like we're seeing about half of our attendees are from child welfare, a lot from mental health, and a good amount of others. So thank you for sharing that. And it looks like we are starting to slow down on that one, and the percentages are staying roughly the same. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to end that one, and I'm going to launch the second one, which is your position type: direct service, supervisor, manager, administrative support, director, etc. Okay, and I see lots of votes coming in on that. So we've got a lot of direct service, supervisor, manager, and then a fair amount of others as well. Wonderful. Give that just a second. And those percentages look pretty similar. So about 43% direct service. And about 26% supervisor manager. Okay, thank you. All right, so let me introduce today's presenter. Alan O'Malley Larson brings 40 years of experience as a social worker, clinician, supervisor, consultant, program developer, administrator, and trainer. Very busy. He is certified as a compassion fatigue educator and therapist and a certified clinical trauma professional. Alan has provided numerous workshops and consultation on secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue to various human services organizations and conferences across the state of Minnesota, as well as multiple times at the San Diego International Conference on Child Maltreatment, and in collaboration with the National Child Abuse and Neglect Technical Assistance and Strategic Dissemination Center, as well as with the Advancing California's Trauma Informed Systems Project. In addition, he co-teaches a 40-hour advanced best practices in child welfare course. Alan is currently program manager of the Youth Behavioral Health Program with Olmsted County Child and Family Services in Rochester, Minnesota, where he is the lead manager regarding secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue. He is also at the forefront of his agency's work regarding trauma-informed child welfare practice, sexually exploited youth, and juvenile justice child welfare crossover practice. Clinical experience includes work in the areas of sexual abuse treatment, substance abuse, couples and family therapy, and child and adolescent behavioral disorders. So Alan, at this point, I'm going to have you take over the slides. So I will stop sharing and you can go ahead and start sharing.
Okay, well, good morning to those of you out on the West Coast, and good afternoon to everybody east of there. It is an absolute pleasure of mine to be on this webinar and to share what I can about secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue and to work with the CEBC. So I'm going to cover a lot of information today, and I'm probably going to go through it fairly quickly, but as noted, you will have access to these slides. And I believe my identification information is at the end. You can always contact me further if you please. The agenda, I'm going to start talking a little bit about what I call multidimensional human services workplace stress. I'll do a little overview of secondary stress reaction, compassion fatigue, and some dynamics related to that. Talk a little bit about the idea of self-care, and then spend time talking about what I consider to be some of the critical strategies for mediating secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue. That would be compassion satisfaction, reflective practice, self-regulation, radical compassion, and self-awareness. Now, notably, more recently, I've been framing these 5 strategies also as what I might call 5 critical skills for effective helping. I'm pausing just a bit because I'm having my own little technical issues. Here we go. So let me start with a brief overview of secondary stress reaction and compassion fatigue. And I want to start by borrowing an idea from Elizabeth Criswell, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota. And she talks about the idea that when we do trainings or teaching or what have you around issues that are related to trauma, that we need to be mindful that folks in the room who are participating, students and whatever, maybe have histories of what we call ACEs. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that acronym standing for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And she's just noting that we need to be mindful that folks listening to this might have some things in their past that we need to pay attention to. I would also include intergenerational and historical trauma experiences as part of what we need to pay attention to. And as such, I just want to borrow this modification of some of Elizabeth's work. Today, I'll be talking about the emotional impact that this work we do can have on each of us. And as such, it is possible that you may find yourself experiencing feelings and thoughts that may be distressing. Please feel free to take whatever measures you need to take care of yourself. Let's start by taking a nice deep breath and letting it out slowly. I'd like to incorporate this into the work that I do as a way of kind of bringing us to the moment, but also a way of quieting the mind and preparing our core, so to speak, for the work that we're going to do. Sometimes I feel like that's what we do. We hold up the weight of the world, and in doing so, we hear the screams and witness the suffering that sometimes becomes our screams and our suffering, only we choke it back and continue bearing the weight without complaining and without acknowledging that we too need relief. Some of the terminology that I'm sure you've been familiar with: secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and then that more general sense of burnout. And it is my belief that the differences between these are not all that important. What we're really talking about here is the emotional impact that this work is having on us. So whether we use one term or another isn't all that important, in my opinion. We've been using the term secondary stress reaction to kind of encompass all of that. And so you'll hear me refer to some of these different terms, but I'm talking about essentially the same process. The definition that I've been working with, and I will make a note that much of this presentation is information that I have gathered and borrowed and stolen and so on from other folks, and I've tried to give credit where credit is due. So the definition that I work with is that secondary stress reaction is the emotional cost of caring. It's a response to the cumulative experience of empathic engagement with people who are suffering, the personal experience resulting from helping or wanting to help the suffering person. Let me put that just a little bit of perspective here, and this is what I call the multidimensional human services workplace stress model. And this is just a way of thinking about all the different elements of workplace stress and child welfare and other human services that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And you'll note that it either includes personal stress on the one side, personal history on the other. I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into this. One of the handouts you will get has a link to a micro presentation that I did on this particular element that you can access and get more detail on that. For the most part, what I'm going to be focusing on today is on the far right-hand side of that, the secondary compassion, as well as some of the little dynamics that are noted in there. I like to inject a little bit of humor. I think all of us can kind of relate to this, the difference between what it felt like when we started our work and then what it kind of felt like a year or two later. I do have to chuckle because sometimes I look at the bottom picture and I think, you know, he seems to be a lot happier than the guy on top, but I'm not sure about that. Secondary stress reaction is an occupational hazard. It is the nature of the work that we do, and having an emotional response is the norm. I have a colleague who refers to the idea that this work that we do has an inherent emotional current that flows through it. And just as if you stepped into a flowing stream, you're going to feel that water. This work has an emotional impact on us. There's no way to avoid that. Some of the symptoms of secondary stress reaction would include emotional symptoms, anger, sadness, grief, and so on. Physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, sleep problems, fatigue, and so on. Personal problems, issues, isolation, cynicism, irritability, so on. And we know that folks in human services are at an increased risk for alcohol or substance abuse. And then for those of you that maybe are in the supervisory and management director positions, a very, very important reason to be paying attention to secondary stress is the workplace symptoms that can result. Things like avoidance, lack of motivation, job productivity, job dissatisfaction, and retention. And I think it should be noted that different people experience secondary stress or any type of stress in different ways. Some of us, maybe it's more emotional, some it's more physical, and then sometimes it just depends on the situation in terms of how we experience that. At one point I came across this slide and I shared this with my daughter, and she came back and said, you know, Dad, it's kind of like burning new pathways in the brain so abruptly and forcefully that the system is on fire. It just can feel that way sometimes in this work that we do. Some of the challenging situations that I think probably leave us a little bit more vulnerable to experiencing the secondary stress would be frequent or continuous exposure to the suffering of clients. And this can be especially difficult in work with children. Certainly, we tend to be more empathetic and more appreciative of the struggles that children have. Exposure to details of traumatic events, either directly in face-to-face sessions with clients or indirectly through written information. And I think that last section is important to recognize that just reading about some of these things, just reading referrals and reports and police reports and reports from doctors and so on, that in and of itself can help or can lead to secondary stress. High caseloads, including frequent crises, limited resources. I've seen some information that would suggest that perhaps one of the main sources of secondary stress is the idea that we want to help, we kind of know what to do, but we don't have the resources to make that happen. Isolation is critical. The more isolated we are, the more vulnerable we're going to be to secondary stress reaction. And I've added to this list the notion of complications related to historical trauma. Folks who live in, who are parts of cultures and populations that have these histories of trauma are certainly going to have an extra, I think, vulnerability as well. I might even refer to this notion of malaise as another sort of symptom or experience coming out of secondary stress. Van Morrison has a song where he goes, "You got to fight every day to keep mediocrity at bay." Just the idea that we have to work so hard to get to this basic level of functioning just to do our job, let alone do it well. Minnesota native Bob Dylan has a similar idea, and he says in one song, "I used to care, but things have changed." That's secondary stress to me, and that's the kind of position we don't want to get ourselves into. It was a wonderful fresh air interview with a 20-year veteran of the New York Police Department, and just the one phrase he uses in there, to me, just captures so much of what secondary stress is like. It just can wear down your soul. I want to talk about a couple of other dynamics that are related to the work that we do that I haven't seen a whole lot of information on, but I think is really important. And the first one is this idea of decision fatigue. The decision fatigue essentially is the notion that we go through the day making tons of decisions. It's decision after decision, and quite frankly, we get tired and we get fatigued, and our mental capacity gets worn down, and we're just not in a position where we feel like we can make a good decision. The research I saw on this was taking a look at parole decisions. And what they found is that if your parole hearing was first thing in the morning or right after lunch, the odds of having your parole granted were increased versus if it was later in the day and later in the afternoon. My daughter has worked for a number of years in the correction system in Tennessee, and she says, "Dad, the inmates know this." So the idea here is that over time, over the period of minutes and hours, we just make so many decisions, we get tired. And also we have this depletion of mental energy, which has some correlation with glucose levels. In other words, the further we are away from having eaten, the more that the glucose levels in the brain go down, and it just sort of reduces the energy that we have to make decisions and maybe think clearly as a result. What they found in the research was the results of decision fatigue is either the decision is going to be impulsive or you'll do nothing. So in the case of the parole thing, they were finding that a lot of times they just decided not to grant parole because, well, they knew that this person would be able to come back later and take another shot at it. So the idea was doing nothing was one of those responses. Obviously, this isn't the place that we want to be in when we're doing this difficult work that we're doing. Another element that I want to talk about is emotional labor. And emotional labor is essentially the work that we have to put in just to be able to respond to the types of experience and feelings and thoughts that we're having based on what we're dealing with. Another NPR Fresh Air interview for the hospital chaplain, she talked about the idea of the stories I've heard, and I need to keep it together. One definition of emotional labor is the notion of masking true feelings in order to present the self in socially and professionally desirable and appropriate ways. I have a good friend who talked about it as sort of like constantly having to wear the mask. Paul Simon sings, "Everywhere I go, I get slandered, libeled. I hear words I never heard in the Bible. And I'm so tired, but I'm trying to keep my customers satisfied. We do this all day long in the child welfare and human services world. But no matter what's facing us and what we're dealing with, what we're thinking, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, we need to make sure that we're working through that and being able to keep the customer satisfied or do the thing that's going to be the most appropriate and professionally helpful. Brian Miller talks about this idea of empathic strain. And he says that the emotional effort required to maintain a stance of unconditional positive regard, while the authentic emotion of the worker may be one of anger, disgust, or defensiveness. This type of emotional effort can be exhausting and may even be a primary source of emotional or compassion fatigue in doing child welfare work. I would like to emphasize that he uses the term authentic emotion here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not like we have to share everything that we think and feel. By saying authentic, Brian is referring to the fact that this is what comes up, this is what we experience, this is what we think, this is what we feel, and that we have to struggle with that. Nikki Weld says, and talks about showing respect and warmth, and says, this can be challenging if we do not particularly like or respect the person's behavior. We might find ourselves reacting strongly to a person's behavior and want to distance ourselves from it or display our disapproval of it. Emotional labor. The work it takes to get from what we're thinking and feeling in the immediate sense to saying and doing the thing that's going to be professionally appropriate and helpful. This top quote is a text message that one of my staff got from a client one time. You are the devil that came into our lives. I don't know for what. The second quote is one that is often heard, I think, in child protection and child welfare. You're the reason that my family is being torn apart. I put these up here not in any way to disparage the folks who say these things, because there are reasons for that. There are things that they've experienced and so on that led them to come to this conclusion. My point is, this is the type of thing that we will hear in child welfare that we need to then work through and mask our true feelings in order to present the self in socially and professionally or desirable, appropriate ways. I think we can all relate to this, the challenge that we have and how important it is and critical it is, because we're not going to be very helpful if we're saying the first thing that comes to mind, so to speak. Another element of work of child welfare stress, in my opinion, that I don't hear too much discussion of either, is the notion of ambivalence, what I call ambivalence management. And I would just ask you if sometimes it doesn't feel like this. We're just not sure. We just don't know for sure what the right thing to do, to say, what decision, what case direction to take. And I think that at the very best, we might be 75-25. In other words, we're 75% sure, but 25% unsure. I think most of the time in child welfare work, we're probably in this notion of 55-45, where we kind of think we know what's the best thing to do and where to go with this case, but you know what, there's a big part of us that really isn't so sure. Maybe we should go this way. I suspect in reality it's not just 55-45, there's probably 3 or 4 different pieces we're dealing with. So we end up with something like, I don't know, 35-30 or something like that. The point is that we're really not sure. There's a lot of uncertainty in this work, and that is stressful for us, because we're constantly, again, needing to make decisions, land on some place in terms of our work, and we're just never really sure. I define ambivalence management as the emotional strain or labor involved in mediating or parceling out one's ambivalence and uncertainty. And we need to represent or land on one side of this ambivalence while suppressing or even dismissing that sort of minority perspective. Not only do we struggle with this on our own in our work, but I think this plays itself out sometimes if we're doing group consultation, where you see people start to take sides, and pretty soon people are, one group is really sure we need to do this, another group is really sure we need to do that, when in fact, I don't think anybody is really over 55-45 probably. So of course it does beg the question of what do we do? And I would like to describe that as we need to dialogue with the ambivalence. And what I mean by that is 3 things. Recognize it, talk about it, and own it. Recognize that we're not sure. Let that be an overt process where we're talking about it. I think even with our clients, we need to talk about the fact that, you know, I am not 100% sure, but I believe this is where we need to go. And then owning it, owning the fact that we aren't sure, as opposed to thinking we are. Okay, so what? Human service workplace stress, including secondary stress reaction, is inherent in the work that we do. Therefore, we need to do preparation and not prevention. I'll talk just a little bit about self-care and wellness. One of the handouts you'll have access to is the self-care wheel, which I think is a wonderful summary and overview of the different dimensions of self-care: physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, professional, with very specific examples of what we're talking about when we're talking about self-care in each of those areas. This wheel was developed from a self-care worksheet assessment, self-care assessment worksheet, and you can use it as such. You can just go through there and say, what are the things I'm doing? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? And what are some things I might add to my repertoire in order to take care of myself? I look at self-care and wellness as an enhancement of our sense of resilience. There are limitations, though. I think there's research suggesting that self-care in and of itself does not mediate secondary stress reaction or compassion fatigue. There was a study that was done at one point that said it does not appear that engaging in any coping strategy, and I think they're referring to self-care things, has an impact on the immediate traumatic symptoms. In other words, the secondary traumatic symptoms, self-care is not going to take care of that. So I think we have to look beyond self-care and wellness and see them as necessary, but not sufficient. Which probably, again, brings us back to, okay, well then, what to do? Well, we could do this. Bonnie Martin says, we are not strong enough to do this work, so we have to be smart about the work that we do. Preparation, not prevention, and we can't just tough it out, that kind of thing. We have to be smart about what we do. Another handout that you'll have will talk about organizational strategies, and I'm not going to talk too much about that right now, but there are some links on this handout to some work that I have done in collaboration with Cambria Rose Walsh from the Chadwick Center. A couple of pieces of work that we were able to do that is online, and you'll have access to take a look at, that will dig into this idea of organizational strategies and make reference to a wonderful document that was put together by the Chadwick Center in regards to, it's called Secondary Traumatic Stress in Child Welfare Practice, Trauma-Informed Guidelines for Organizations. And I would highly recommend taking a look at that and downloading that so you can get some other ideas about what one can do as an organization. Because it is critically important, in my opinion, for sure, that not only do we need to have strategies that we utilize as ourselves and what we might do in terms of supervisors and workers, but as organizations, we need to do some things structurally and operationally to support folks in the work that we're doing.
All right, I'll go ahead and launch the poll. Let me go ahead and do that. So you should see the question: how would you rank your organization's recognition of and efforts to specifically address secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue among its workforce? So we got votes come in. We'll give that a minute for everyone to take a to vote on that, and then I'll launch the results. Okay, it looks like it's starting to slow down the votes, so let me just give it a second. And I will go ahead and close out that poll and show you the results. So as you can see, the largest category was fair, 36%, with 30% saying good. And then the next one, poor, 21%, non-existent at 8%, and excellent at 6%. Okay, I will close that out, and Alan, you can go ahead and continue.
Thank you. I'm quite pleased with those results in the sense that I think if we'd have taken a sample like that maybe 5 years ago, it would have been much more weighted in the lower end of that. So I'm glad that we're spending much more time about it. And I think it's even infecting, I shouldn't say infecting, but I think the idea of secondary traumatic stress is making its way into our post-secondary education and master's graduate programs, where they're recognizing and talking about that more, which I think is absolutely critical. When I do these presentations, I will often stop and ask folks to reflect a little bit on their involvement in this profession and ask them, what brings you to this work? How did you come about choosing this line of work? And then as I listen to the responses, and I would ask you to think about that for yourself a little bit. So as I ask people to share on that, and I get all sorts of different responses, but I think it all kind of boils down to the desire to make a difference in the lives of others. I think no matter how we answer that question of how do we get into this work of child welfare, human services, mental health, it seems to me it kind of boils down to some variation of this idea that we really want to make a difference in the lives of others. And is there really anything more noble than that? This idea of compassion satisfaction, which I will talk about a little bit, is the first of those 5 strategies that I talked about. To me, that's the sense that one is making a difference in the lives of others. In other words, the degree to which we can feel like we're accomplishing what we were trying to accomplish is compassion satisfaction. We did a study in Colorado and found that despite a high risk of compassion fatigue, these staff members had a low risk of burnout, finding that compassion satisfaction may mitigate these levels of burnout. In other words, that sense that you're making a difference in the lives of others really does help. And I'm of the opinion that compassion satisfaction is probably the key to not just surviving, but thriving in this work and actually being energized by this work. If we can get that feedback that tells us we're making a difference, the things that I'm doing are changing people's lives for the better, quite frankly, I can put up with a whole lot of stuff that isn't pleasant if I know that in the end, that's the result. Let me talk a little bit about this idea then of modulating and enhancing the emotional experience of this work that we do. Talk a little bit about actuating compassion satisfaction, engaging in reflective practice, adherent self-regulation, radical compassion, and self-awareness. Strategies to enhance compassion satisfaction. The first thing I'll talk about is this idea of appreciative inquiry. And it's possible that some of you are familiar with this notion, but essentially appreciative inquiry is the idea that we are purposefully and intentionally pulling out the good work that we do and making a big deal out of it. One of the technical descriptions is the intentional elicitation and amplification of good practice. Essentially, again, we're digging in there and talking about the good work, we're asking about it, we're pulling it out, and then we make a big deal out of it. We talk about it. Eileen Monroe says more valuable lessons can be learned from examples of successful decisions than from the ones that lead to loss or harm. And other folks have talked about the idea of appreciative inquiry as a way of making conscious what might be an unconscious process. Sometimes we do things that we're not even aware of or we don't think about. But the problem is if we don't have an awareness of that and we're not conscious of it, then when we're struggling at some point, it's pretty hard for us to go, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? If we have spent a lot of time taking a look at good practice, pulling it out, making a big deal of it, then when we get into a tough spot, we can reflect back on what have I done in the past or what has somebody else done that I've heard about. Some of the questions that related to appreciative inquiry during case consultations or case or just contemplating on it yourself. Things like, in what ways can you give yourself credit for the positive outcome? What did you do or say that helped the client to make the change? What did you do or say in that situation that you feel really good about, that you're proud of? We have a process in Olmsted County where once a quarter, which is way too infrequent, but we do what we might call a case celebration. And we take a case that's gone well and closed successfully and whatever, and we bring all the different people who've been involved in that case, from the case manager to the supervisor, maybe even the front desk people, so on and so forth. and we talk about how well the case has turned out, but then specifically asking these kinds of questions. And what did you do to help make that happen? Tell me something about that particular case that you're really proud of. You can pat yourself on the back. Elicit that information, make a big deal out of it, and then serve everybody cupcakes. The next area I want to chat about is a reflective practice. And I define this as the ability to step back from the immediate experience to sort through one's own thoughts and feelings about what is happening in one's work with clients. And this kind of touches into that emotional labor idea, but just that ability to kind of step back from what we're experiencing and sort through our own thoughts and feelings about that. Reflective practice is about the process of what's happening and not the content of what's happening. If that makes some sense. Nikki Weld talks about reflective practice as transforming that internal emotional experience into constructive action. If we look at it from the brain science standpoint, it's moving the process from that limbic reaction process down in the amygdala, where it's fight, flight, and freeze, to the prefrontal cortex, where it's thoughtfulness, intentionality. I kind of look at it in this sort of way, that the impact of emotional reflection on effective service delivery. We'll have this stress-inducing situation, which leads to an emotional reaction that could include ambivalence, decision fatigue, and so on. And what we know is that when we're under stress and so on, it does inhibit our ability to think clearly. So it leads to cloudy reactive thinking, it inhibits our compassion and empathy, and it blocks access to what we know. Robin Bilzerian, who does a lot of training on emotional freedom techniques, calls this a state of foggy brain. And I'm guessing we've all been there, where we have that foggy brain where we're just not sure, we can't think straight, we don't even know what we know. So if we can engage in reflective capacity, including self-regulation, then eventually the mind clears up, we have clear proactive thinking, we can access what we know, and we might even have what one Bob Schwartz refers to as spontaneous cognitive shift. And the idea there is that we're struggling, we're not sure what to do, we can't think clearly, we calm down, we regulate, we reflect on it. All of a sudden the mind clears and boom, we know exactly what to do or think or say, leading to effective action. We'll talk about self-regulation. And I define this as the ability to use physiological and cognitive strategies to allow the use of critical thinking skills to develop and implement intentional, thoughtful, and purposeful intervention strategies. I know that's a mouthful, but the idea again is that we're able to slow down, we're able to regulate so that we can engage the prefrontal cortex, essentially. There's some evidence that would suggest that stress reduces the prefrontal cortex functioning to 60%, while the amygdala remains at 100%. That's not a ratio we want where 100% of our fight, flight, and freeze elements is operating, and our ability to think and plan and be purposeful and compassionate is only at 60%. Winograd and Cohen, in their book about work ache, say in times of stress and fear, the compassion circuitry goes offline. Again, not a good place to be in terms of wanting to be helpful or feel good. And we know that brainstem limbic networks process threat within 1/5 of a second. The point being that these things happen quickly. Our brain can go there just like that. Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is the power to choose our response. So what this notion of self-regulation of emotions and cognitions does is helps to widen and subsequently allow us to utilize that space to be more intentional and planful and helpful. We also know in a lot of our work with trauma victims that self-regulation results in comfort in one's body, restoration of the prefrontal cortex functioning, and again, intentional instead of reactive behavior. The importance of self-regulation. Take another breath. Let it out slowly. Talk about radical compassion. And radical compassion, the way I've come to define that, is the ability to suspend critical judgment and engage in compassionate thinking and actions in relation to clients who exhibit behaviors that trigger a reaction of dislike, disgust, abhorrence, or the like. Ryan Miller contrasts radical compassion with critical judgment. The notion that radical compassion is non-judgmental empathy for all clients we're working with, regardless of their current or past behavior. I was at my clinic the other day or a while back, and as I was checking in, I was peering over onto the desk of the person who was checking me in, and I saw this little cue card: be kind always. I've seen an employee video from a major corporation, and one of the things they say in there is, every life has a story if we take the time to read it. That's radical compassion. I've come to the conclusion that compassion is a choice. It begins with the intentional consideration of the raw humanity of the other, which leads to an empathic appreciation of their condition and results in generous, hospitable, and loving action. The poet Miller Williams writes, "Have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. What seems conceit, bad manners, or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone." It's always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone. Miller's daughter, Lucinda Williams, is a musician, and she's put this to music, and the song is called Compassion. If you have time to look that up and Google it, it's a wonderful, wonderful musical treatise of this particular poem. How do we achieve radical compassion? Well, it's not so easy. We did a thing in our church, a series on compassion, and so that included the Sunday school kids, and one of the fourth grade students said, "Compassion takes courage." How do we achieve it? First, we have to acknowledge and affirm the feelings that we are having, even the ones that we may not like, but recognize them, affirm them, and then put ourselves in the client's shoes. Ask ourselves, why do I think they're doing this? Why are they acting this way? Why are they taking this disturbing action, saying this hurtful, frustrating, or annoying thing? What's going on down there where the spirit meets the bone for this person? And maybe even how might this parallel my own experience, and in what ways are they just like me? Self-awareness is the last element that I want to touch base on. And what I mean by self-awareness is that ability to consider one's own history and experiences. For example, family of origin, adverse childhood experiences, trauma history, historical and intergenerational trauma, and other life experiences. Be able to consider those things as influencing our perceptions, our perspectives, our beliefs, values, and actions, and interactions with clients. Being able to be aware of what do we bring into this job that, quite frankly, might make us vulnerable to secondary stress or to not being as helpful as we can. In a room full of caring people, ACEs are high. Kind of getting back to where I started out with what Elizabeth Criswell said. The research will say that the average ACE score of people in the human professions or human services is higher than the average population. There's probably reasons for that, but it's just something we need to be aware of because it is important and critical that we are alert to the areas we may be vulnerable to. And I think there's also this interplay of historical trauma and intergenerational traumatic grief. And we know that trauma history results in a reduced regulatory capacity. So in other words, the more stuff we've got of our own that might be unresolved, the more challenges we're going to have in terms of doing the work. Some questions one might ask around this area are, what types of clients do you sometimes or often find hard to work with? Which elicits some stress response in you? Which client situations are difficult for you to deal with? Why do you think you're having this difficulty? I'm not talking about therapy. I'm talking about awareness. Be aware and then be prepared so that we can make a difference. So what else? Does this look familiar? Going to work, coming from work, or this? Watch how many hours you work and take your vacations and your time off. A long time ago, a group of hikers were trekking to Mount Everest. The expedition had started days late due to impassable weather, and the group was pushing their mountain guides to hike hours longer than usual each day. One day, after days of pushing hard, the Sherpas simply refused to go. There were angry words and offers for more money, but the guides wouldn't budge. Finally, their translator explained, "They say they have walked so fast that they need a day for their souls to catch up to their bodies." How many times do we feel like we've gotten way ahead of ourselves? The critical nature of making sure we're taking time outside the workplace, we take our evenings, we take our weekends, we take our vacations in order for our souls to catch up with our bodies. And another thing, at the end of the day, turn off the dang smartphone. Now, I know there's times when we have to be somewhat connected to work, maybe 24/7 or when we're on call, that kind of thing. But for the most part, I think we really overdo that. I've made a habit of when my day is done is I take that little icon on my smartphone that takes me into my work emails, and I just press on it and slide it over to the back screen so I can't see it. I've turned all notifications off. I don't get red lights. I don't get little buzzes. I don't get little beeps. I don't get numbers telling me how many unread emails I have on there. And I can't tell you what a difference that has made. And there's some evidence that smartphones are stressing us out, shortening our lives because of that chronically raising the levels of cortisol, which is all about fight, flight, and freeze. So just in closing, I guess, one more challenge in this area is sustainability. It's great that we might know this information about secondary stress, but what are we going to do about it? How do we make it more than a passing fad, and how do we build it into the way that we do business? And I would refer you back again to some of the reference to some of the organizational strategies. How do we design our organizations? How do we design the workplace and our work in such a way that we're taking stock of this idea of secondary stress and doing some of these things that I've talked about to help mediate that? So in conclusion, if we do all these things, if we radically care for those we work with, and if we take radical care of ourselves, then perhaps we can still smile at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and I'll take over from here. So we do have time if attendees have questions that they'd like to ask of Ellen, please go ahead and enter those in the QA at the bottom of your screen. I'll go ahead and give people a minute to start entering questions. And then just a reminder, we have our next CBC hosted webinar will be on March 16th. And the topic will be working with gender nonconforming and transgender children. We know this is something that we're seeing much more of in the child welfare system, I'm sure in other human services sectors as well. So we hope you will join us for that. And you can sign up for our email alerts through the link here, and that will get you on the mailing list for all of our future webinars. So let's take a look at some of the questions that have come through. And Alan, I'm going to just read a few of these. Oh, quickly, let me let folks know, we will be sending you the PowerPoint and the handouts through email probably within the next 24 hours. And then within the next week, we will have the recording along with all of the materials posted on the CBC website. And you will also get an email to that link. So I know we have a few questions about that. So here's a question from one of our attendees. Anzette has asked, have you heard of and what are your thoughts on the concept of vicarious resilience? I don't know, Alan, if you have any.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I have heard a few things, and I've done a little bit of reading on that, and I think it's a very interesting concept. And as I would understand, it's the idea that in the midst or as a result, perhaps, of having some traumatic experiences or whatever, that we actually can grow from that. That there's some seeds of opportunities involved in that, and I think that that also can apply to the work that we're doing. That working in this heavy, emotionally laden field doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be overwhelmed by it and struggle. We also may come out in a very positive manner and gain a lot of strength from that. So I think I like that idea. It's something that I would hope to do a little bit more exploring of, because I think it's very important.
Okay, great. And we will include all the responses to the questions in the recording as well, so you can get those. Another question was about where can we find more resources on integrating practices into our business model?
Again, I think the reference sheet that you're going to get to organizational response will be a good starting place. The particular manual that's referenced in there that you can download gives a number of different ideas. It's set up from the standpoint of what we can do from the very beginning of employment, if not prior, all the way through the different stages of employment for the first 3 months, and then maybe the 3 to 12 months, and then later on as well. I'll give you an example. One of the things that we've started to do is we've been incorporating questions around secondary traumatic stress in our actual interview process, so that we're having those discussions right at the get-go. We've also talked about the idea of having folks who are coming in to apply for our work to be able to view what's called a realistic job preview that helps to make sure that folks who are getting into this field understand what the job is really all about. So there's some different strategies that you'll find in that manual, as well as in the other links there. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're asking, but that would certainly speak to how do we integrate this into our everyday work versus it's a nice idea that we hope people do.
Okay, great. And again, those handouts will be sent out via email to everyone on the webinar, probably later today or first thing tomorrow. A couple more questions. Actually, we have quite a few questions. So how do you balance all of this with the ever-growing caseload sizes, the turnover rates that are just amazing these days? How can we help with this?
That is a $1 million question, and probably literally $1 million question. Because that is the case, is that if we are overwhelmed with caseload sizes and constant going from crisis to crisis, it's pretty hard to be at our best or even beyond the mediocre range, I think. So I think that's where this really does become a critical factor for organizations and management to look at. And unfortunately, it tends to boil down to the dollar. It tends to boil down to the funding sources and how much county boards and state systems are willing to fund the work that we do. And I think you're all familiar with the idea that we get more and more expectations and mandates, but we don't get the resources to go along with that. One of the things I'm really pleased about that we're starting to look at here at Olmsted County is we have these timesheets that people fill out, and we're now moving into a stage where we're going to say, put down exactly how much time you're working, so that we can look at that and say, okay, maybe we need to make adjustments to your caseload, or maybe we need to look at adding some resources to the programs. Now that's kind of pie in the sky, and of course it always means that we have to work with the county boards and so on about that. But I think it's a good movement on our part. Excellent question. It's a tough challenge, and I just don't. Again, I think you're right on. If we're experiencing that, it's pretty hard to do good work sometimes.
Great, thank you. Okay, another good question from Bethany, who asks, for the appreciative inquiry piece, is it important for the person to call out their own successes versus other coworkers celebrating it and calling it out for them?
I like the combination. I think it is a combination, because we do know what our peers are doing, and there's often times when we'll be sitting in a consultation and somebody will be talking about the work that they do, and they might not even recognize, yeah, this is good work, and somebody else says, you know what you just did there, that was really good stuff. I've toyed with the idea of, in my consultations, of having a designated person when we talk about cases as a team, having a designated person who's going to pay specific attention to that type of thing. And then when they see it, call it out, name it, make a big deal out of it. Now, certainly it has to eventually get into the awareness of the individual person who's working the case, but I think the combination of asking the person directly to reflect, but also what are other people seeing and hearing is critically important, which is all about gets us to the importance of having teams and working on these cases together and being able to share what we're doing and what we're struggling with, but what we're successful with, and countering that whole idea of professional isolation, which is far too common in our work.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about supervisors, so I'll go over one of them first. Kat is asking, are there any extra tips for supervisors who are working with staff experiencing particularly high levels of secondary stress?
Well, I think the primary thing is to make sure that it's getting acknowledged and affirmed, and giving the message real strongly that this is part of the work that we do. It's not a personal deficit of you. It's not that you have to be stronger. It's not that you have to pull yourself up for your bootstraps. It's not that you just have to toughen up. This is tough work, and let's talk about it. Let's make it okay. One of the things we've talked about too is when we're onboarding new staff is to give them the message, that very message. This is hard work that you're doing. We need to talk about it. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. I think there's a certain fear among young workers that if I show signs of vulnerability and where I'm struggling, I may get fired or might not even feel like this is the right job. No, we need to talk about that. We need to give permission as supervisors to make that an important discussion thing. We have incorporated into our performance reviews, and although we really should do it at a different time, we do ask questions about what's your level of secondary stress, how have we been responding to that as an organization, as a supervisor, and then maybe if some things come out of that, we might even develop a wellness plan, so to speak, as part of our relationship. The supervisor is highly, highly critical. If we don't understand this stuff, if we don't validate it, if we don't give folks permission to feel it and talk about it, then it's going to go nowhere.
Great, thank you. And another question relating to supervisors, as Monica's asking, is there a training for supervisors who work on supervising those indirect care? Do you have any recommendations on those sorts of materials?
I can't. You're catching me off guard a little bit on that one.
Yeah,
I know there is stuff out there. I also know that there is, and I think this is available through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They've developed what they might call core competencies for supervisors in addressing secondary traumatic stress. And so it talks about all the different sort of skill sets that we need as supervisors in order to deal with that. I would say that if you went to the NCTSN website and put in core competencies for supervisors around secondary traumatic stress or something like that, maybe even Googling that, you might get a link to that very extensive document that talks very much about the importance of supervision in child welfare around strategies and core competencies and so on.
Okay, great. Alan, we'll also try to provide that link on the CEBC website. The page for this webinar will have some of these additional resources. Okay, so I know
Great.
We're almost at the end of the hour. I think we have time probably for one more question. And Steph is asking, how do we deal with decision fatigue? What are some tips and tricks when child welfare decisions can be so hard?
You know, and part of the challenge with that is that idea of that we start to lose our mental capacity as we get later in the day. Part of the challenge for me is it's really kind of inherent in child welfare work that a good bulk of our work actually occurs at the end of the day and in the evenings, because, you know, the idea of having to meet with families when they're not at work, meeting with kids when they're not at school and so on, it almost puts us a little bit behind the 8 ball, so to speak. I think a lot of it though is about self-care now. Whereas I said things about self-care as being necessary but not sufficient, there's a critical difference between self-care that we do, you know, like tomorrow or on the weekend or in the evening, and the difference between that and doing some things in the moment. In other words, the breathing stuff. We can do that in the moment. We should do that in the moment. The idea of mindfulness, we should do that in the moment. The more we can do it in time, in real time, it's going to be helpful. I think recognition of decision fatigue, I think talking about it, I think making sure we give ourselves some space throughout the day to recuperate and regroup. I think those kinds of things would be helpful. I really believe that just awareness and acknowledgement and talking about these dynamics is well over half of the battle. And if we've got that within our culture, that we recognize these things like decision fatigue, we're talking about it, we can name it when it's happening, we could recognize it when we're experiencing it, I think that goes an awful long ways.
Great, wonderful, thank you. And I see we are at the end of our time, so I want to respect everyone's time for attending the webinar. As I said, we will try to get some of these additional questions answered with Alan and get those on the website. So thank you for attending the webinar. Once again, please be looking for an email within the next 24 hours that will have the handouts and the PowerPoint slides, and then we should have the recording of the webinar posted within the next week. So thank you very much for joining us.